So I'm out here at the Pisgah baseball field, our local high school, and I know we have Tuscola fans and other schools watching, and so don't hold that against us, but we are a Canton school, Canton church, and we love our local baseball team. But you're probably like, why in the world are you at the baseball field? Well, to me, being out on this empty field is very symbolic of plans that just didn't happen, dreams that didn't happen. When the COVID pandemic struck, spring sports were just done. We didn't get to have any spring sports. We didn't have college sports. We didn't have high school sports. We didn't have little league sports. And here we are sitting on this empty field, and I think about the fact that there are plans and dreams and hopes that did not happen this spring. You had seniors who were going to play their last season of high school baseball, and that didn't happen. In the broader scheme of things, you had graduations that didn't happen. You had seniors in college who didn't walk out and play their sport. And it was just some dreams that, to be honest, were crushed. And I don't want to set the tone and make you feel sad, but it is. There's a sadness to that. There's a grief to that. We've spent the last couple of weeks talking about what we do when our plans change. And we've been learning about how to process those things. And what I want to end with today is I want to talk about, have you grieved the loss of your plans and your dreams? And when we think about grief, we often, a lot of times, we think about death. I know for me, for a long time, if you said the word grief to me, I thought you only grieved when someone you loved died. But one lesson that I've learned over the last few years is that grief comes in lots of different forms. And any time we experience loss, and it can be the loss of a job, it can be the loss of a relationship, it can be the loss of plans, it can be dreams that we suddenly realize are not going to come true, there is an element of grief that is involved in that, and it is healthy and it is right, and we need to give ourselves permission to grieve. Matter of fact, when we look throughout Scriptures, and we look at the stories in the Bible, and we look at the people in the Bible, we see moments when they grieve. When they grieve their sin, they grieve their losses, they grieve over and over. Matter of fact, there's an entire book of the Bible called Lamentations that is a book about grieving. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because there's a specific type of grief that is kind of solely a Christian thing, and it's a Jewish thing because of the Old Testament, and it's called lament. To lament is a specific way to grieve that we as Christians are not only given as a gift, but it's a privileged thing that we have today. And so we're going to talk about lament. The big thing about lament is that you grieve, but you grieve with God in mind, and it always ends up with you putting your trust, your faith, and your hope in God, despite the fact that your plans have been changed. And I think if we are going to grieve well, and if we're going to grieve in a healthy way, we've got to learn as Christians how to lament. And so to do that, we're going to look in the Psalms. We're going to look at one specific psalm today, Psalm 13. It's a psalm that David wrote. King David was one of the ancient kings of Israel. He was called a man after God's own heart. He wrote a majority of the Psalms that we read in the Bible. Psalms are basically poetry, and they would have been sung, they would have been read. And in Psalms, you have what are called Psalms of Lament. And in this psalm, David is grieving over a season in his life when life is just not going his way. Things have changed. I think as we read this, we can relate to it. But what I want to tell you up front is this, okay? As we're getting ready to look in Psalm 13, I want you to go ahead if you're taking notes, and I want you to write this down. We have to get real with our pain over our uprooted plans and dreams. See, that's the problem. A lot of times we will bury our grief, we will bury our dreams, we will bury our plans, we bury our pain, we bury our sorrow, and we just will not get honest and get real with it. But if you are going to be healthy, if you are going to be whole, if you're going to be able to grow into the person that God desires you to be, you got to get real and you got to get honest with God sometimes. Because here's the thing, He already knows your heart, He knows your pain, He knows your feelings. And you need to learn to get real. You need to learn to lament. And that's what David is going to show us in Psalm 13. So let's just walk through this together. Look at what he says in verse 1. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Now, the first lesson you got to understand is you have to make a choice to talk to God. We look in the verse here, and David is bringing his questions to the Lord. He says, "How long, Lord?" He is going to God with his grief, with his hurt, with his pain. And see, the problem is a lot of times what we will do is we isolate ourselves. Now, we've been in a forced isolation the last couple of months. Thank goodness that we're moving out of that and we're getting to see people, and we're going through phases here in North Carolina, and I know in other states. Some of you guys are watching in other states and you're like, yay, I get to see people. But we also will make the choice to isolate ourselves from God. And we do that when we're not willing to go to God in prayer and get honest and get real. And I think two of the reasons we do that. One reason we do that is because of self-sufficiency. I know for me a lot of times I think I can handle this. I got the plan. I can take care of this. I'm tough. And a part of me thinks I'm not going to bother God with my problem. Well, why wouldn't you bother God with your problem? He's your Father. He loves you. That's one reason we isolate. One reason we don't choose to go to God with our grief, with our sorrow, with our pain. Another reason, though, is our sin gets in the way. I know last week, Caleb Simmons, our Connections pastor, he taught a great lesson on why sometimes our plans change because of our sin. But we also, because of our sin sometimes, we don't go to God in prayer. I know for me, there are moments in my life when I know I have made a mistake and I've allowed sin to get in the way. And in that moment, or for a few days after, even minutes or hours after that, there's a part of me, because I know I've sinned, I don't feel like I can go to God with my prayers. But the problem with that is, if you have Jesus Christ, if you've been set free, you can go to Him. Jesus died for your past, your present, and your future sin, and the enemy of your soul wants you not to go to God. And God's like, come to me, repent of your sin, and let's get on with this. Let's have a conversation. I'll give you an example of this. This past weekend, I had went kayaking with some friends, and we were out in an area, and we had to cross the road, and it was really crowded. There were lots of people. There were bicyclists everywhere, and I think the locals were getting annoyed at everybody. And I had crossed the road. This old guy stops. He rolls down the window. I go up with a smile on my face. He looks at me and goes, "You ever been run over?" And I'm like, no. He goes, "You're fixing to." I'm not too quick on the draw, so I didn't have a smart comment to say, thank goodness. But it made me really mad. Here's the problem. I got angry. I've been dealing with anger a lot lately. And because of that anger, afterwards, I start to feel bad about myself. I start to feel convicted, as I should feel convicted. But I've noticed in those seasons, for some reason, there's some moments of time, instead of immediately going and confessing and going, "God, I got angry, forgive me," I stew on it and I don't feel like I can go talk to God about it. And that's just silly and crazy. So the first part of that is like David, you go and you choose to talk to God. But then when you talk to God, you get honest. Look at what David does here. He says in verse 2, "How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me?" Now David here, second thing you got to do if you're going to lament is you got to bring your complaint to God. Not in a sinful complaining way, but an honest, "God, what is going on here" kind of way. Look, he says in verse 1 and 2, he asks 4 times, "How long am I going to have to endure this, God?" He says, "Have you forgotten me, God?" He feels like God's absent. God's not absent, but it's how he feels. He says, "I'm having to wrestle with my thoughts." He's having to wrestle with sorrow. He's having to wrestle with pain. And then he says, "I've got this enemy, and the enemy is triumphing over me." Something was going on in David's life at the time where he didn't feel like he was winning. And have you ever felt like that? Have you dealt with an addiction that you can't feel like you can't get over? Have you dealt with depression or sorrow or grief over the fact that life is radically different right now? And you feel like you're up against this enemy you can't beat. Well, you got to get real with God about that. That's what he's doing here. You see, you got to humbly and honestly take your questions and your pain to God and the frustrations that you're feeling and voice them. And I know sometimes, some of us that grew up in church, we grew up with this warped theology that you can never bring your complaints to God. You can never bring your doubts to God. You can never bring your hurt to God. You can never bring your frustrations to God. But honestly, I don't see that in the Bible. I mean, I'm reading a psalm right now written by God, a guy that God said is a man after His own heart, and he is complaining. He's voicing his hurt. And God is big enough to take that. And when you're in a season when the dreams and hopes that you had and the plans that you had are suddenly ripped away from you, it's okay to go to God and ask why. You may not get all the answers on this side of heaven, but it's okay to go with Him. It's okay to go to Him with those things. And that's what David's doing here. And of course, he doesn't stop there. See, that's the problem though. Sometimes what we do is we get mad, we get upset at God, we get angry at God, and we stop there. We are never to stay in that position where we just simply complain and are mad and are hurt and are doubtful. That is not the place to stay. You voice your concerns, but you're moving down a road. It's kind of like I'm sitting here at the ball field. You know, the guy, when he hits the pitch, he doesn't stay. He has to move around the bases to get back home. And that's what lament is. You're moving around the bases. You're going through a process that will get you back home to where you're trusting and you have faith and hope in God. And so how do we keep going around the bases? Well, look what he does in the verses. Look what he does in verse 3. He goes on and he says to God, he says, "Look on me and answer, Lord, my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death." He's wanting his understanding to be enlightened by the Lord. That's what he's saying there. He says, "My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall." So what he's saying here is he's literally asking God to help him. And so what do you do when you get real with God is you choose to talk to God, you bring your complaint to God, but then as you're around third base, you ask for God to help you in this season. You see, that's what he's doing here. See, that's the problem. We don't need to get silent and not go to God and say, "God, help me." We don't need to get to the point where we despair so much that we can't go to God and say, "God, help me out of this." You see, the problem is a lot of times we get silent, and unlike David, who's willing to say, "God, enlighten me, turn the light switch on," we will either do two things. We either despair, and despair is where we live with no hope, and that's not Christian, because we have the ultimate hope in Jesus, or we deny. We say everything's fine. And that's not healthy either, because when we're at the point where we're grieving the loss of our hopes and our dreams and our plans, or we've been in this season we've been in, it's not healthy to go, "Oh, everything's okay," because everything's not okay. And if everything's not okay, then you got to go outside of yourself and ask for help to make you get to the point where everything will be okay. And so you go to God and you say, "God, help me." I've been kind of angry over the last couple of months during this season. I've not been able to really peg the root down, but one thing I have been doing is I've been sitting there going, "God, I need you to help me with this. I need you to take this anger away from me. I need you to help me in this season. I need you to help me." I think part of my anger is we had some plans as a church. I had plans in my life, and now I realize that everything is up in the air, and I guess the way I've dealt with it, some people have dealt with it with depression. Some people have dealt with it by trying denial. Some people have dealt with it with sorrow. I think I've dealt with it with anger, maybe. And I've had to get to the point where I've been like, "God, you got to help me with this." And maybe you're at the point where you need to have an honest conversation with God, and you need to say, "Lord, help me with this." And so that's it. That's the third base. But how do you get home? Well, see, lament, grieving in a Christ-like way, always has a purpose to bring you back to God. And I want you to notice here, this is exactly what happens in this verse. Look what he says in verse 5. He says, But I trust in your unfailing love." David has voiced his pain. He has voiced his doubts. He has voiced his complaints. He is asking for help. But then he ends up saying, "I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. And I will sing the Lord's praise, for He's been good to me." Look at that. In the end, at the very end, what David is really doing here, this is the fourth thing you have to do if you're going to lament, if you're going to get real with God, is at the end, all Christian lament and Christian grief leads to this. We choose to trust and we choose to hope in God. I've heard it said sometimes, people will say things like, in the whole grief movement, and we have people who are in Grief Share. It's an amazing program. But sometimes I'll hear this statement. People will make this statement. They will say, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And while I believe that to a degree, I do believe there is a wrong way to grieve for a Christian. Like, what do you mean by that? Some of you out here have experienced huge loss, and you went through your own journey of grief, and you may be like, wait a minute, man, my grief is my grief. But here's why I say there is a wrong way for a Christian to grieve. The wrong way for a Christian to grieve is to grieve with no hope. And the reason I say that is because we have the ultimate hope in Jesus Christ. Through His death, His resurrection, through our relationship with Him, we understand that no matter what we lose in life, no matter what plans may be changed, and we need to grieve those plans, we need to grieve those dead dreams, we need to grieve our losses, but we understand that all hope is not lost. We do not live with despair because we have ultimate hope in Him. And that's where David's getting to in this psalm, is he is not grieving as a man with no hope. He is choosing to trust in God. And in the end, in verse 6, it says, I will sing the Lord's praise because He's been good to me. Despite what David is going through here, he says, I can still stand up and I can worship. And he can still keep life in perspective because he says, God's been good to me. Now sometimes when we get in seasons where we've lost a lot, or this season when things hadn't turned out the way we expected them to, sometimes it's hard to say God's been good to me, but I want to challenge the Christians that are listening to this. God has been really good to you because He gave you Jesus. You have the one thing that can never be taken away from you, and that's your relationship with Christ. The new identity, the hope, the peace, the joy that you have that can see you through any circumstance and any dream that may die and any plan that may get changed. And that's why, I say that as Christians, we can grieve with hope. That's the right way for us to grieve. We lament, and that's what lament is, ultimately, is to bring your complaints, to bring your sorrow, to bring your grief to God, but continuing to hope in His promises. Paul, a couple thousand years later, over in the New Testament, in a letter that he wrote to the Thessalonians, would talk about this. He would say, I'm writing this so you won't what? Grieve like others who have no hope. Think about that. That's some powerful words. That's some encouraging words. And so, we see here, we're looking at this as we wrap this up. I'm sitting here out on this ball field where some dreams got crushed because kids didn't get to play their last season this year. But we can still have hope. So I want to ask you this question. Honestly, when's the last time you got honest with God about your pain? When is the last time you sat down and you got real? Maybe what you need to do is you need to go somewhere this week. You need to go somewhere when we're done with this. When you're done watching this, you need to get alone, get in a place where you can connect with God and go through these 4 steps. Go through them. Choose to go to God in prayer. Choose, to talk to Him. Choose to bring your complaint to Him. And in the end, make the choice, after you've done all of that, and you've gotten real, you've gotten it off your chest, and you've cried some tears, choose to trust Him. Because here's the thing. When a batter hits that home run, he goes through the bases, and you go through the bases of lament, it gets you back home where you belong, with your Father. And here's another encouraging thing. This dugout's empty right now. This field's empty right now. But there'll be kids back on this field again. Coach Shepard and all those coaches will be over here giving passionate instruction again. Fans will fill those seats again. We hope in that. And it will happen again. And in the same way that this field will get filled again, and this dugout will have kids sitting in here, chewing gum